Louis Mountbatten was the uncle of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the second cousin once removed of Queen Elizabeth II. And Louis Mountbatten was far more entangled with the Russians than Donald Trump is today. Intelligence professionals from the CIA and the MI5 strongly considered him to be a traitor, while critical historians believe he was blackmailed with crucial letters stolen by the Soviet spy Anthony Blunt. But there's another scenario that goes much deeper than old-school treason. Now, as the Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia Command, and former ruler of India, Louis Mountbatten's actions seemed to benefit the Soviets and brought several countries closer to the sphere of communism. So, Louis Mountbatten was not just all about talk. Conservative MPs in Britain, Winston Churchill and even the Americans, were increasingly worried. Adding to that were Mountbatten's positive views on socialism. His very close companion was the homosexual Marxist Peter Murphy, whom he had met 20 years earlier at Cambridge. In 1952, the British MI5 was finally allowed to perform a thorough investigation into Murphy, which did not turn up evidence for treason, but which wasn't reassuring either. Mountbatten was known to be bisexual or homosexual, and Britain's laws against homosexuality at the time made every gay person a potential security liability. Now, lots of politicians and intelligence professionals were scratching their head. How could this be that Louis Mountbatten held such important posts and was associating with people like Murphy? The book War of the Windsors puts it bluntly, and I quote, "Virtually everything Mountbatten did after the Second World War played perfectly into the hands of the Soviet Union, working against British and in particular American interests. Mountbatten's actions in Southeast Asia seem designed to move the whole region into the Soviet sphere of influence." Now, his friend, Professor John Bernal, a Marxist, of course, facilitated contacts to the Soviet Union and to certain Soviet spies at Cambridge like Anthony Blunt and Guy Burgess. CIA sources complained that Mountbatten personally blocked investigations of a senior Royal Navy officer suspected of passing secrets to the enemy. Here's another quote. "Most incredible of all, in the mid-1950s, Mountbatten was in secret contact with the Soviet Ministry of Defense." So that was very serious business, and of course this was much more pronounced and much more clear than what we see today with Donald Trump. Now, this whole Donald Trump affair we've covered before and we'll continue to cover it, but with Donald Trump, as of this day, we still don't have any ironclad proof of anything. Of course, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that looks very strange indeed. But Louis Mountbatten, he was actively shielding Soviet agents. He was friends with Soviet agents, and he was surrounded by possible Soviet agents. So, was he really ideologically close to Russia? Did the Russians have blackmail material on him? Maybe even of a sexual nature? All that reminds us of the Donald Trump Russiagate scandal, yet at the time with Louis it was much more concrete. Mountbatten publicly declared that he wanted good relations with Moscow, even though the communists had killed his family during the Communist Revolution. But did they really? So Louis Mountbatten's real name was not Mountbatten, but instead his real name was Hessen-Darmstadt, and this made him part of the family of the Russian Tsars. For generations, the Romanovs had married princesses from Hessen-Darmstadt, the Grand Duchy of Hessen and by Rhine in Western Germany, which meant the royalty of Britain and the royalty of Russia was one and the same. Historians can't convincingly explain why Britain did not save the Tsars from the communists, but rather supported the communists and left the last Tsar and his family to die. Bones that had been lying in a shallow grave for over 70 years under fluctuating temperatures were forensically analyzed in the 1990s by scientists from Russia, Britain, and the US. They claim to have extracted relatively long sequences of genes belonging to the Romanovs. Other leading scientists noted that it was impossible to get long DNA strands from old bones under such conditions. There must have been some sort of contamination, thereby rendering the bones useless as evidence, and no matter how often you retest those bones, it's still not real evidence. There was also doubt about a blood-stained old shirt or piece of cloth that was conveniently found in a museum and attributed to the last Tsar Nicholas. And decades of exposure to UV rays and oxygen ruled out that this blood sample or supposed blood sample could yield usable, identifiable DNA. But the Russian scientist proclaimed a great find, yet refused to share his data, or his source data. If the DNA tests were not convincing, we have no body and therefore no clear evidence of a murder. A lot of Romanov Grand Dukes and their relatives simply left Russia on British ships during or shortly after the Communist Revolution. Some of the Grand Dukes are said to have been murdered, but either the bodies were not found or some bodies were only identified by papers found in their clothing. Not convincing at all. The most convincing scenario is that every Romanov got rescued and that Tsar Nicholas plus his wife and children were secretly shipped to a place in Denmark, for example, hosted by their relatives. The Communist Revolution was not necessarily the end of the Romanov rule, but maybe a new start. The old ways of governing were unsuited to control a society that was becoming larger and more complex. The population hated the Tsars, and several assassination attempts later, the Tsars hated the concept of open rule. The communists in Russia were supported by the Tsar's own intelligence service, Okhrana, and by the Anglo-American intelligence community as well. So the Communist Revolution and the subsequent Civil War not only created a new system of tyrannical government, it also drove out or destroyed the regular aristocracy of Russia, which had defied Tsarist leadership for centuries. So maybe Mountbatten didn't betray Britain to the Soviet Union. Probably the Soviet Union was his country as well. And almost our entire modern understanding of history is based on an unconvincing, possibly fraudulent DNA analysis. So maybe this leads us to the bottom of this whole story, and some people have gotten fairly close, such as the historian Anthony Sutton, who is nowadays largely forgotten, even though he touched upon the deepest secrets of the superpowers. He identified organizations such as Skull and Bones, which are tied to the monarchy and to the royal families, tied Skull and Bones to the Russian Revolution. And so if we go further, if we investigate this cluster of royal families, it's not just the ones you see on the British throne. If we analyze these families, and we also analyze the Russian Tsarist intelligence agency and their overlap with British intelligence, the whole communist revolution seems to appear in a much different light. Now, standard conspiracy literature has propagated the myth that this communist revolution was the work of Illuminati Jews, and this was part of this whole Jewish world takeover, the Jewish world conspiracy. Now, granted, some of the people who took part in that revolution were Russian Jews who've been subjected to abuse for centuries, and some of the visible, infamous revolutionaries had a Jewish background, but let's face it, a revolution on this scale, had to be, and the facts show, had to be the work of the British colonial empire, and had the help of the Russian czars. They did not want open rule anymore. They needed a new type of government, and they also needed to get rid of the classic Russian aristocracy. And for centuries, the czars had failed to remove the regular aristocracy in Russia from power. And notably, all of this propaganda about a Jewish world conspiracy, all of this propaganda goes back to the intelligence services of Britain, of the United States, and the intelligence agencies of Russia. So, for example, the protocols of Zion originated in Russia, came out of this whole czarist system and czarist intelligence. And then the protocols of Zion were spread in the West through British circles and American circles, influential circles. Not just Henry Ford, the automaker who printed 500,000 copies of the protocols. And as well, in many books of classic conspiracy literature, written by such strange people as William Guy Carr, who worked for the British Empire, or Nesta Webster, who was born into the higher circles of the British Empire. These weird conspiracy authors, they propagated the myth of Jewish world dominance and the Jewish world conspiracy, twisting even the history of modern banking. Like, for example, the whole Rothschild business, a very small family, which started in the Frankfurt ghetto in Germany, and then was slowly over decades built up by the British Empire, or the family of Hessen-Kassel, closely related, of course, to Hessen-Darmstadt. And Hessen-Kassel created the Rothschild banking dynasty as a front, because these royal families, they did not want to bother with all this daily business of moving money around, right? So Hessen-Kassel needed puppets, and the Rothschild clan, they were ideal for that purpose. And so the Rothschild clan was built up, and Rothschild handled more and more money of the British Empire, and thus establishing that myth that was twisted by classical conspiracy literature, the myth of five Rothschild brothers taking over the entire British colonial empire with a bit of banking. This myth is believed to this day by almost everybody in the classic conspiracy audience. Don't have exact statistics, but I'd say at least 85%, maybe 90%. They really believe that five brothers from a very small family, these five brothers stole the British colonial empire, and nobody stopped them, and nobody punished them, and nobody killed them, nobody poisoned them. And we're talking about one of the most professional and vicious empires in history. So it's borderline impossible that that banking clans such as Rothschild, they took over the empire and they ruled it all, and they didn't care who sits on the British throne. That's a fake quote, by the way, attributed to Nathan. Never did anybody show a source for that quote. So yeah, and by the time the 5 Rothschild brothers became somewhat important, by that time, of course, the royal clans, the royal families, they had hundreds and hundreds of members and thousands of members, and they had so many illegitimate children put into important positions. So this was a very, very solid empire. And we have to look past the cliches. We have to look at this from an intelligence standpoint and figure out what really went on with the Russian Revolution, and also with the Chinese Revolution, which is also very suspect. I'll get to that in another video. So, yeah, if you can, grab a hold of the book War of the Windsors. It's a pretty decent book. Everybody should have it. It's pretty hard to get nowadays. Fairly hard to get. But you also need to view this in a context, okay? So, the world believed that the Tsars died and the rule of the Tsars had ended. And nobody from mainstream media or regular historians can convincingly explain why the British Empire, or the Anglo-American Empire, why they supported the Soviet Union from the start through technology sales and credit and recognition. So why would the Anglo-Americans do this? Why would they support the Soviet government from the start? This is only conceivable if the Anglo-American Empire controlled the Soviets from the start. There's no other credible explanations. There's no other credible explanation. All right, so much about Louis Mountbatten, and of course his descendants are now more and more in the spotlight, such as Prince Harry and Prince William. Every time there's a marriage, they parade in their uniforms. Harry even grew a beard to look more like an adult. And at some point in the next couple of years, they will probably rise up in military circles and have functions maybe comparable to the functions that Louis Mountbatten once had. So when the East-West conflict heats up, when there's something dramatic happening and everybody gets scared in the population, the governments will assure us that they know what's best for us, and they know how to handle a crisis like this, and they will also present to us the current generation of royals, such as William and Harry, to calm people down and to give people the impression that the problem is being handled by professionals who have dealt with such problems before, and so on and so forth. But let's not forget the real history of Louis Mountbatten and the weird history of the Soviet Revolution. And let's not forget that the British royal family, as they're called, the people on the British throne and their immediate family, that's only a small fraction of a large cluster of families. And it's weird to see that classic conspiracy literature, has never really properly researched the royal families. They only focused on Queen Elizabeth and the Saxon-Coburg-Gotha line, but not much else. So, if you enjoy this kind of research, if you appreciate that, please subscribe to this channel, please support us on Patreon, and comment down below.